because either answer to the question is going to end up making you look like a dumbass. And let me explain why, right?
I do have a question, Josh. Do you reason that there cannot be evil in the world if God is good?
Even the
Yeah, we're good.
one is good.
Yeah, where God is understood. Where good is understood. God being good means something like holy good, and we understand that to be and omnipotent and omniscient. When God is understood that way, then that's inconsistent with there being anything that ought not be the case.
Now here's how I look at it. Just from an Epicurean standpoint, God being omnipotent. I mean, yeah, we believe that. The willingness of God to prevent evil. He is not willing. I'll agree with that. And evil itself, right? And so when we think of like Jesus being crucified, being an innocent man, that is evil. And but yet, God being all, could he have stopped it? Well, yes, of course he could have stopped it. Was he willing? No, he was not willing that Christ should be spared of the cross. And yet, this evil was permitted by God, right? And 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 Epicurus would call that malevolent, right? Because
Well,
he's not
yeah, but
deserving of that. However, the way Christians understand it is that that's a good thing. This permission that God allowed this evil to happen to Christ, it is through faith in Christ that men are saved, and that's a good thing. And so we understand that God, at least in this particular case, that God permitting evil to happen was a good thing. And so
right.
the,
But if
the
you
killing itself was evil, right? So, but the permission of it is good. That's my point.
well, look, yeah, the whole thing is I'm not asking whether or not there are competing reasons, although I don't know what that would mean in this situation. But if it's understood normatively, right, that state of affairs ought to have obtained, then I'm saying on the balance, whether or not there are some logical factors, right, like some sort of redemption arc that make it such that all things considered, it ought to have occurred, or um, or if you're saying something like or if it's just some sort of like limitation on God or whatever because he's not omnipotent. I mean, I assume that you don't want to take that route, but say it's of some sort of logical equivalence, like there needs to be some sort of redemption arc or something like that's good. Then all things considered, it ought not to have been the case that Jesus was not crucified, right? It ought to have been the case that Jesus was crucified, and so that was not.
But the permission of it is not evil. That's what I'm saying. So when people say it, well, there's two things. There's the created agent doing evil. That is always evil, right? But yet the permission of evil to occur, that, if as God wills it, is good. And so, at least in that particular case, we can at least see that there is good in the permission of Christ suffering and dying on the cross for our sins, right? He was not deserving of death. He was an innocent man. So in other words, when we look at all the other types of evil and suffering that we see around us, if you're willing to acknowledge that there was good in that, well, it stands to reason that it's possible that anything that we see, even the sexual abuse of a child, there can be good from permitting that to happen. The challenge is for the atheist to say, no, that's not possible. That good can come from this particular instance, but that would be a burden I don't think the atheist can make.
Well, I'm glad that you think that all things considered, some children should be molested, but
Well,
um,
I didn't say
I'm
that.
not. Well, you said it could be good, right?
I'm saying that through that evil act that's permitted to happen, that the atheist cannot say that good cannot arise from that evil act being permitted. That is not to say that act in and of itself is good. No, clearly that act is evil. I'm talking about God's act. His act is separate. His act is separate in such that he permits that to happen, which is a separate act, and that permission is good for reasons beyond our own understanding.
Well, I don't understand what the whole reasons behind beyond our own understanding. I mean, when you say something like that, it just sounds like it's unintelligible. Like it sounds like you're saying it's good, but I don't know whether or not it's good, right? And that just sounds like a contradiction.
Well, I can give you many examples just within
But
my own
I'm
mind.
not looking for examples. Let's
Okay.
just use this language. Uh, let's just use this language you're talking about where God is permitting it, right? I'll take evil to be there. There are only three notions that are at play here, right? That is morally obligatory. It's not the case that it's morally obligatory, and it's not the case that it's morally impermissible and morally impermissible, right? Those are the only three
I
options
have a
that you
different
have.
option I might be able to offer.
Sorry, I just want to explain the trichotomy, right? It's either A,
Well, then you're not
it's
deserving
either
for critique.
so. Well, I'm just talking about the normative
You
space.
just
I'm not.
fabricated your own parameters.
No, I'm just talking about. I'm not. I'm talking about the state of normative possibilities, right? Right. You can say there are only two possible normative facts, right? And it's in it, and there's also a possibility that the act has no normative import, right? Those are the two. Those are the three possibilities. So that's what I'm
Seems
accounting
like
for,
you're
right?
arguing with
It's
yourself.
no. I'm trying to explain. I'm trying to explain the space, and I wish you would just let me explain the space, right? For any given act, it's either the case that that action ought to occur, or it's the case that it ought not to occur. That exhausts the normative possibilities, right? It's either the case that it ought to occur, or it's the case that it ought not to occur. That exhausts the normative possibilities. The other possibility is a non-normative possibility, which is it's not the case that it ought to occur, and it's not the case that it ought not to occur. So those are the only options that you have, right? It's either the case that it ought to occur, or it's the case that it ought not to occur,
Yeah.
or it's the case that it neither ought to occur, nor it's the case that it ought not to occur.
Now you do understand there's two actions going, and you seem to have simplified it to one act. There's the actual act of the created agent, and their act, which we can declare as evil, right? But
Yeah, but you
there's also the act of God permitting. That is a separate act, which is good. So, and when you ask, is it good or ought it be done? You've simplified it to one act. When clearly there are two actions: the act of God permitting, and the act of the agent, committing sin or evil or whatever you want to add. And so I don't think it's fair for you to characterize it to combine it when one is good and one is evil. Clearly,
look. That just means that there's the view is like whether or not the action, like whether when we're talking about like what you said, like the molestation of a child, right? Now, if it's the case that you ought not allow a child to be molested, and you allow the child to be molested, then you're doing something wrong, right? But if it's the case that you ought to allow the child to be molested, then it's not the case that anything wrong is.
yeah. I mean, I just gave you the example earlier with Christ, in a sense that permitting it was good. The act of killing him was evil, killing an innocent man. What these people did, clearly two different things.
Look,
And so, but it seems like you want to try to say, well, God ought not to let something like that happen. Who says
there,
who?
there's only a couple ways to countenance this, right? The event that we're talking about is Christ being killed, right? And
Right.
there's only a couple ways that you can countenance this, right? On the balance, whether or not now I could I don't think that this makes any sense, but I'm willing to grant it for the sake of argument, even though this doesn't make any sense at all. You could say that there are two normative forces there that end up canceling each other out completely, right? God permitting it, and the evil thing that shouldn't occur, which I don't understand what shouldn't means when you can permit it and it shouldn't happen, but you don't permit it. I don't know what that means, but set that aside. Um, uh, we can say that the evil there ends up canceling out, or the good there ends up canceling out the evil, right? And nullifying any normativity there. So it's neither the case that it ought to occur, and it's not the case that it ought not to occur, right? Though that's one way out. But then again, you're just saying that it's not the case that it ought not to occur. And so when evil is understood as some event or that ought not to occur or whatever, then there is no evil on that view.
Here's the thing: the act that the agents did to kill an innocent man, who is Christ, it demands justice, right? There's wrath in that, and so that's a good thing because justice is a good thing. To overlook that act and do nothing about it would be not good. It would be evil, right? And so the way that we Christians look at it is that there's no deed that goes unpunished, but within our Christian view of atonement, that punishment is meted out on Christ on the cross, and so there is no suspension of justice. The justice is meted out on Christ, and we receive mercy, and we get what we do not deserve, right? And
Right. But
I
this is
I
what I'm trying to figure. I don't understand.
okay.
I don't understand any of that stuff about dessert or
Okay.
whatever. That all sounds confused to me. But I just want to understand on the balance of things. Do you think that there's stuff that whether or not justice is meted out? You said justice being meted out is a good thing, right? So
Wouldn't you
what I'm
agree
trying to
though?
understand. What?
Wouldn't you agree that justice is good?
Well, it's that sounds like a tautology, right? Just,
Really?
ju- yeah, justice is just defined as good.
Well, justice would be like, a person makes a violation, and there's consequences, and they get what they deserve in the sense of the consequences, and it would be unjust, in a sense, to reward that act, or that kind of thing.
Right. Here's what I'm trying to understand, right? Say that there was nothing violated or whatever. There's a couple options the way I see it, right? Either it's the case that it's bad that there was nothing violated because justice ought to occur, and justice requires some violation, right? So either it's the case that there was no justice, and that's bad because there should be justice, so there has to be evil. I think that you just have an incoherent view on that option. But let's say for the sake of argument that that's not your view, that it's not that justice is required or whatever, or like morally obligatory, that there has to be justice in a world, because there could be a world with no justice. That doesn't mean that there's a world with any injustice. That just means there's no punishable violations that occur, right? So if it's the case that there is no punishable violations, um, it's either the case that it ought to be the case that there are no punishable violations, or it's the case that there ought not to be no punishable violations. So you can either have a world with justice um, and injustice, or whatever is what you're talking about, which I think one is logically required. And all things considered, you ought to have a world with justice, or it's the case that you not have any injustice at all. But you can't have it both ways, right? And so if that's the case, either way, if you're a good being and justice is morally obligatory, that just means that injustice is simply instrumental, and on the back are things that ultimately ought to occur. So everything ultimately ought to occur, and if everything ultimately ought to occur, then there's no evil.
Yeah. Now, once again, you just look at it in one paradigm. You don't. There's two separate things: the act itself, right, by the agent, and the permission by God. And you keep saying it, right? No, you have to say, as far as the agent, we look at this way. As far as God's permission, we look at that way. If it is the case that God judges righteously, right, and the person, the perpetrator of the crime, sin, what law, whatever, you know, if
Well, let me just
if
ask
they
you the
are
question
punished,
succinctly.
that's a good thing.
Let me just ask you the question succinctly. ought to be the case that there exists a world where there are injustices and God metes out justice, or is it the case that there ought to be no injustices?
Well, it is the case that God, um, allows evil to exist, and that He is a
Wait, but you're
righteous
not answering my
judge.
question, right?
No, I am
You're not
answering it,
No, no.
and
I'm giving I'm giving it like a dichotomy. I'm assuming
and
well
so
the
so
reason. Let me just clear. Let me just be clear because I'm not clear on what your answer is. So I'm going to tell you what the two options are. I'm going to label them A and B, and you just tell me which option you think is the correct option. Ought to be the world. Ought to be the case that there is a world in which there is justice, or and that's option A, or B ought to be the case that there is a world in which there's no injustice.
well, it would be A, of course.
There could just be a world where there are no injustices at all.
Okay,
Now,
here's
I would
the
think,
problem with your
I
thinking.
would think, let's just finish. I would think, like for me, what I would prefer is that there was just a world where there were no injustices, right? But if you think that tolerable world, that's an evil world, a world where there are no injustices, which I don't even understand how that's coherent, right? That just sounds incoherent on the face of it. But if you think that that's a problematic world, then it just follows that your notion of justice implies that there has to be some notion of injustice, and all things considered, it's required. And so, therefore, all things considered, the world is as it ought to be. And if all things considered, the world is as it ought to be, then all things considered, it's not the way that it ought not to be. And if it's not the way that it ought not to be, then all things considered, there is no evil.
Yeah, and so once again, you think of it in a single pair. You keep saying it. I don't know how many times I have to tell you. It is a
I'm
good
talking
thing.
about the world or the state of
Hang on.
affairs.
Let me finish. It is good that there is justice, right? And so when you look at justice, you look at God being the judge, the arbiter, the lawgiver, right? And the one who's able to save and destroy. And so this is good. However, in order to be just, the righteous judge must decide or be the arbiter of evil. And so let us not call evil good and good evil, right? The act itself is evil, 100%. But the justice of that evil act is good. And I don't know why you keep trying to combine the two into one view when there's clearly on this end it's good, and the one receiving justice or wrath in this case is also uh, a good, but the agent themselves and what they did is evil.
I don't understand the way when you're calling it evil, right? Because I'm talking about like just take it from a first person perspective, right? Say you see someone who's about to fucking rape and batter your wife, right? Now you have the ability to stop them, right? And you also have the ability to allow them to do it. And if you allow them to do it, you also have the ability to mete out justice, right? Okay? Let's just say for the sake of argument that that's the state of affairs. Now, there's a question. What should you do? Should you stop that person from raping your wife, make it so that no injustice occurs, right? Which I think it's like I said, it's almost tautological. It just seems like justice is understood normatively, and so you should avoid injustice. You should stop injustice. You should not allow something that's unjust. That's how I understand justice. I don't know how you're understanding it. But
What?
let's just say that you're not understanding it that way, right? And if you're in a position to mete out justice in that case, then you're saying that you ought to allow this person to rape your wife so that you can punish them.
Wait a minute. How about this? Why not allow it so that you could forgive them. How about that one? By demonstrating your love for them, that while they were sinners, that Christ died for them.
I don't care what I don't
Why
care
couldn't
what the
it be for
reason
that
is, whether or not
purpose?
it's to whether
Why
it's
couldn't it
not
be for
to
that purpose that God allowed that?
whether it's not whether it's to dole out justice or to be merciful or whatever the reason that you think that your wife should be raped in that situation is sort of irrelevant to me, right? Because in that situation your wife should still be raped.
If it is the case that that the wife is permitted, child, whatever you want to say, right? For the purpose of forgiving, being merciful to the perpetrator, the sinner, right? The lawbreaker, whatever. Uh, is that good or not? In a sense of the person being forgiven,
What?
is mercy not a good thing?
Well, I mean, I don't. If I was in the
Maybe you
position,
don't. Maybe you don't think mercy is a good thing. That's possible.
well, I don't really understand what mercy is supposed to be, uh, really. But if I were to take the notion seriously, then I would just have to consider whether or not, all things considered, mercy is preferable to there just being no injustice, which, like I said, also sounds contradictory. Because on my view, there just shouldn't be any injustices. So if I have the capacity to stop injustices, what I ought to do is stop injustices. That's just it. Like I said, it's almost tautological. That I wouldn't even understand what, injustice was on that view. Right? It doesn't even sound coherent to me to say that there are permissible injustices. It just sounds like there are things that shouldn't occur that should occur. Right?
Yeah.
That sounds like a
Well,
contradiction.
I mean, if you were omniscient, right, then you might have an idea of why, uh, why you have allowed that to happen. And so, in the case of if you had limited thinking, well, you ought not let Christ suffer and die on the cross because he's an innocent man. You ought to stop it because you have the power to stop it. In your limited thinking, that might be the case, but we see in God's wisdom and providence that he was unwilling that Christ should be spared from the cross. And because of this, we understand the goodness of God. We understand the demonstration of God's love and his mercy and compassion to forgive. And so, even in the example that you gave about the rape of the wife and so forth, and even if it's the case that God chose to demonstrate his love to the rapist himself, right? That cannot be said that it's uh, not a benevolent, not a merciful uh, act according to his grace.
Right. So let's just take this understanding of mercy as non-normatively, right, and justice non-normatively, so that I can make sense of them, and just say that uh, they're states of affairs that ultimately ought to occur. Like, to be merciful is to, like, to be able to stand on one's head or something like that, right? And you ought to do something that allows you to stand on your head, right? So if you chopped off, uh, your arms, you couldn't balance yourself, so you ought not chop off your arms, because ultimately you ought to be able to stand on your head, right? Same thing is true with mercy. It's not the case that you ought to stop, Jesus from being killed on the cross, because all things considered, you ought to be merciful to these people or whatever, right? Now, this language, the way I'm using this language, it just doesn't even make any sense to me. I'm granting it for the sake of argument, but, uh,
Yeah,
in
but
that case, it's
God
just one
doesn't.
other
There's no obligation for God to be merciful.
in that case, that's just, an instrumental act of goodness. Jesus dying on the cross is just an instrumental act of goodness on that view.
When you say God ought to be merciful, there's no obligation for God to be merciful. He will have mercy upon whom he has mercy and compassion upon whom he has compassion. There's no obligation. There's no ought. There's no reason to think that God ought to be merciful to anyone, but he is, to his
Yeah, I
greatness
don't.
and glory.
Yeah, I don't understand what that means. Then it just sounds like it's not good. Then
Because you made a statement that God ought to be merciful. That doesn't even make sense to me. Where do you get that notion?
why just take mercy to be a normative notion?
Because
An
there's
incoherent
so
notion.
then so
I mean,
then what
I
do you
take
do
it to
with
be an
justice?
incoherent notion at that, right?
You have justice to be a normative notion?
Yeah,
You don't see a problem here?
I think that they're contradictory views. I think that you can't have justice and mercy.
In Christianity, you can. Through the penal substitutionary atonement. Of course you can.
Well, I don't know. I don't know what any of that means, right?
I'll
Because
be
you haven't.
glad to
Look,
explain it to you.
the point is that you haven't addressed the analysis. Which the point is that on the balance of things, everything that occurred ought to have occurred on this view. And if everything that occurred ought to have occurred on this view, whether God was merciful or just or whatever, however you want to understand those terms, I assume you have to understand those non-normatively. But then I don't even understand how you're supposed to get to the instrumental attribution on that view. So I just take your view to be completely incoherent. But like if I were to just grant this nonsense for the sake of argument, you haven't addressed the criticism, which is simply on the balance, everything that occurs ought to have occurred. It's not the case that anything that occurred anything occurred that ought not to have occurred.
Well, the fact of the matter is, see, when you start to bring in these like oughts in there, in a sense that the agent itself, right, doing evil, well, that is an evil act, right? And once again, God permitting it is good. If it is even for to judge the perpetrator, right, and to eternal conscious torment, that is justice. The wrath is justice in the sense that that is good. And so, if it is the case that, as Romans 9 says, it's so that his righteous decree stands in a sense of, um, you know, that being like to show the objects of his mercy, right? The justice that is also there, uh, then it's to God's own glory.
Look, I'm just saying it's fine if God views the crucifixion or the rape of your wife as a means to an end. But I'm saying it's in virtue of the means to that end that ultimately the means ought to occur, right? The means are whatever, like say God wants to be merciful or decides that he should be merciful, that he should, give these people mercy uh, or give these people justice or whatever for whatever they did, right? And he knows that the only way for them to do that, again, if these incoherent notions are to make sense, is to allow Christ to die on the cross or to allow your wife to be raped or whatever, then it just seems like, in virtue of the fact that the ultimate goal, which is good, ought to be done, which is this person is doled out mercy, this person is doled out justice, whatever, then those things inherit their goodness from the ultimate purpose, right? The rape of your wife or Jesus dying on the cross inherits its goodness in virtue of it being conducive to the ultimate goal of mercy or justice or whatever.
Yeah, I just have a couple of questions. I got to mute up, Josh, but let me just ask you a couple of questions. Ought God be a savior?
Well, I mean, I don't know.
You don't know if God ought to be a savior?
Well, I don't have it's like complicated question because when you say savior, like there are a couple ways of understanding that, right?
Mm.
Because you could prevent every injustice and therefore save everybody from injustice.
Well, that wouldn't be saving. That would be preventing.
I don't understand. Like, look, if someone is drowning and I stop them from drowning, I've saved them from drowning. If someone is
That's just
about to be
semantics at that point.
what? If someone is about to be raped and I stop their rapist, then I've saved them from being raped.
I guess what I'm trying to say is that you can't be a savior a savior of committed sins, more specifically, without evil or sin. Do you agree?
Well, I don't know, but that again, it's not going to impact the ultimate analysis whether or not you can. I don't understand these notions that you're talking about, right? Um, that when you use them, but if you're trying to use normative notions like we've been talking about to do these things, and those things just sound incoherent, right? It just sounds like you ought to allow something that you ought not to allow in order to do something that ultimately you ought to do, which sounds like a contradiction in terms.
So you have a problem with permitting sin to exist, and being that the wages of sin is death, and if God were for His good pleasure to save us, right, and being also forgiven is also better too. Like, even when it comes to the situation of Jesus asked, who loves more, the one that's forgiven more or less? And the answer was the one that's forgiven more. So if it is the case that an agent who is a sinner is forgiven by God, that only increases his love for God, or his understanding, his appreciation, gratitude. I mean, the list goes on and on. That would be a better thing than not having that understanding or that appreciation. And so all I'm saying is that God, as we understand God, is a savior. And so, being that He's a savior, He acts as a savior. And just my point is that He cannot be a savior, at least logically, for me, without there being evil in the world. But I don't know if Matt's done. Oh, he left already, right? Yeah, I guess he left already.
Seems that way.
Yeah, I was hoping so I could listen, but maybe I talked too much.
Oh, well, Danny declined the invite, which is unfortunate because he can run this argument, and I would rather him be tortured by you than me. So, where is your God when he ought to be stopping me from being tortured by?
Well, I mean, it seems like an arbitrary out there.
Do you think torture is good?
No, I think that you being tortured is pretty, claiming to be tortured. Not everyone is tortured equally as you are. I
Maybe,
would think it's more self-inflicted based upon your
maybe
lack of
God will
coping
just,
skills.
send
Because
you to
nobody
hell.
forced you here. You
Maybe
can
God
leave.
will just send you to hell, for this, and then ultimately justice will be served.
I mean, if that's what you want to reason, but I mean, I don't know if anyone else wants to interact. I mean, you can talk to me if you want, but
Here's the thing.
Were you gonna say something, Daniel?
Yeah, John, I just had a quick question. I wanted to know what you thought of this distinction between a permissive will and the decree. So it seems like a decree is an order from an authority. In this case, the authority would be God, which would be the ultimate authority, right? In a sense, or the highest authority.
right,
I
just
mean, how?
being in control of all things, sovereign. I mean, that's how I understand. Omnipotence goes in there.
Yeah. So it's interesting that, in one sense, God orders or decrees, whichever word you prefer. In one sense, he decrees all things, right? Whatever comes to pass is by his
Correct.
order to be done. So in what sense are things permitted? I don't quite understand how you can um,
Well,
have both of these things.
yeah. I mean, if you really look carefully at the wording, it says that that evil comes to pass, right? It doesn't say that he decrees evil, right? Because that would be something different. It would be that he permits within his decree for evil to come to pass. by the counsel of his own will. And so that's unfortunately a lot of people misunderstand that to mean God decrees evil. No, that's not what that means at all.
So you would say that whatsoever God decrees comes to pass, evil comes to pass. Therefore, God decrees that evil come to pass.
Yes,
You
decrees that
you
evil
concede that,
come to
right?
pass.
Yeah. So in your mind, what does it mean for something to come to pass, as opposed
Be
to occur
permitted to
or
happen.
happen?
Be permitted to happen.
So that's how you reconcile the decree with the permission.
Yeah, I'll give
You
you
say
an
to come to
example.
pass.
A rape example was given by Josh earlier. The difference in allowing evil to come to pass or permitting evil to come to pass is simply just the unwillingness to stop the rape, right? But when you decree the rape to happen, right, or the evil, then it would be such that he ordered, decreed, ordained, in a sense, that act, in a sense of authorship, that he's the author of that evil.
Just tell
And
your wife when she gets
permission does not
raped.
entail authorship.
Just tell your wife when she gets raped that it's okay because you're going to forgive the guy. You know.
Well, if God did not spare his own son, then in that particular case, why should he spare anyone else?
Yeah, just be like, you know what, honey, I didn't stop. The guy was raping you, and I didn't stop him. Ultimately, it's good because I forgive him. Okay.
Yes, but here's the thing. First and foremost, I'm not God. I'm not omnipotent. I'm not allowing that for some
Would it be
manipulative
good?
greater good,
Would it be good for
in the
you
sense of
to?
being omniscient. So
Would it be good for you to
it's
forgive him?
basically a category error.
Would it be good for you to forgive him?
Of course.
Okay, so yeah, there it is, right? So just say, hey, look, honey, it's okay that he raped you because guess what? It's good because he gave me the opportunity to forgive him.
If that's the purpose for which God permitted that to happen, well, then I accept it, certainly. I mean, there's a lot of things in my life that happened to me that I could tell you,
Well, I'm
right?
saying you
I'm
permit it, right? Like
appreciative
you
for
know
God
that
that it
you can
happened.
stop him. You know that you can stop him from raping your wife, right? But you
You'll forgive
know that
him.
if you don't
Well,
stop
I
him,
mean,
you'll.
Game over. Game over. Lights out.
Yeah, that's fine.
You've just been completely obliterated publicly.
Shut up while I'm talking, right?
Caught. You've been folded like a chair caught with your pants down.
Will you fucking shut him up? I wanna respond.